It was a sunny spring day when the 5th grade class from Arcoiris Municipal School boarded a bus for an educational trip to Butterfly Forest. The air was filled with childlike excitement, but for one particular girl, this day meant much more than just a simple school outing. Emily, a 10-year-old with unruly curls and eyes that sparkled with insatiable curiosity, could barely sit still in her seat. Her slender fingers drummed incessantly on the window as she watched the urban landscape slowly give way to the lush greenery of the forest. "Emily, sweetie, try to calm down a bit," whispered her best friend, Lucy, sitting beside her. "You're going to wear yourself out before we even get there." But Emily couldn't contain her excitement. "I can't help it, Lou. Don't you get it? It's Butterfly Forest. Can you imagine how many different species we might see? Who knows? We might even find one that hasn't been discovered yet." Lucy rolled her eyes but smiled affectionately. "There you go with your biologist talk again." "One day you'll see," Emily declared with conviction, her eyes fixed on the approaching green horizon. "I'm going to discover a new species, and it'll be called Emilyensis." The two girls laughed, but Emily's laugh carried a hint of determination that swelled her chest with pride and hope. As the bus wound its way down the twisting road that led to the heart of the forest, their teacher, Miss Clara, stood up, her face a mix of excitement and concern. "Children, attention please," she raised her voice above the excited chatter. "We're almost there. Remember the rules we discussed in class. Always stay with your group, don't touch anything without permission, and most importantly, don't stray from the marked trails. Butterfly Forest is beautiful, but it can also be dangerous for those who don't know it well." Emily heard her teacher's words, but they seemed distant, muffled by the sound of her own heart beating with anticipation. Her eyes were locked on the first butterflies that began to appear, dancing in the air like colorful confetti. When they finally arrived and got off the bus, the rich scent of damp earth and greenery flooded Emily's senses. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, feeling more alive than ever. "All right, class." Miss Clara's voice cut through the air. "We're going to split into groups for our educational scavenger hunt. Each group will get a list of plant and animal species to identify. Remember, the goal isn't just to find them, but to learn about each one." Emily barely registered the instructions. Her eyes had caught something extraordinary, a glass-winged butterfly, its transparent wings glinting like liquid crystal in the filtered sunlight. It was the most beautiful creature she had ever seen. Without realizing it, her feet began to move, as if they had a will of their own. Step by step, she drifted away from her group, following the hypnotic dance of the butterfly.
"Emily,
"Where are you going?" Lucy's voice sounded distant, almost inaudible. "I'll be right back," Emily called over her shoulder, without taking her eyes off her winged target. "I just want to see where it's going." But Lucy could no longer hear her. Emily was being swallowed by the vast green expanse of the forest, leaving behind the safety of her classmates and teachers. The sound of voices and laughter gradually faded, replaced by the chirping of birds and the whispering of leaves in the wind. The girl didn't realize it, but each step was taking her deeper into the forest, further from the marked trail, further from safety. Her world now revolved around that ethereal butterfly, which seemed to be calling her toward an unknown and potentially dangerous destiny. The enchantment of the glass-winged butterfly dissolved like a dream at dawn. Emily blinked, confused, her vision snapping back into focus. Her heart, once racing with excitement, now pounded with growing fear. The once welcoming forest around her had transformed into a green, impenetrable maze. "Lucy." Her voice trembled, barely a whisper. "Ms. Clara?" Only the echo of her own voice answered, bouncing between the trees like a cruel mockery. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She was alone, lost in the vastness of Butterfly Forest. Emily spun in circles, her wide eyes desperately searching for something familiar. But every tree, every bush, every leaf looked identical to the one before. Panic began to rise in her throat like bile. "No, no, no," she murmured to herself, tears beginning to blur her vision. "Think, Emily, think. You know nature. You can find your way back." Determined, She tried to retrace her steps, but with each move, the forest seemed to shift around her, as if it were alive, deliberately confusing her. The sun, once her bright ally in the sky, now began its relentless descent toward the horizon. The shadows stretched longer, turning familiar trunks into threatening figures. The bird songs, once melodious, now sounded like distant cries for help. The wind whispered through the leaves, bringing with it the promise of a cold and lonely night. Exhausted and disoriented, Emily finally gave in. Her legs trembled as she sank down, leaning against the wide trunk of an ancient tree. Hugging her knees to her chest, she fought to stifle the sobs that threatened to break free. "Mom," she whispered into the darkening air. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I should have listened. I should have stayed with the group." The tears, finally unleashed, streamed freely down her cheeks. Each drop carried the weight of her guilt, her fear, her loneliness. In the oppressive silence of the forest, Emily heard a branch snap. Her entire body froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Who's there?" Her voice was just a thin, trembling thread of sound. Nothing answered except the distant howl of the wind. Emily squinted, trying to pierce the growing darkness. Shadows danced at the edge of her vision, transforming into monstrous creatures of her fevered imagination. "Please," she begged the forest, the universe, anyone who might be listening, "please, someone help me." But the night continued to fall, relentless. The cold began to seep through her clothes, making her shiver uncontrollably. Emily, the girl who dreamed of being a biologist, who loved nature more than anything, now felt betrayed by that same natural world she so admired. As the stars began the sky above the treetops, Emily curled up even tighter against the tree trunk. Her eyes burned from crying, her throat was dry from calling for help. The fear of the dark, of the unknown sounds, and the overwhelming loneliness wrapped around her like a suffocating cloak. On that first night in the forest, Emily learned the true meaning of helplessness. Every minute dragged on like an eternity, filled only with the sound of her own ragged breathing and the mysterious noises of the nighttime forest. At Arcoiris Municipal School, what started as a murmur of concern quickly turned into a wave of overwhelming panic. Ms. Clara, with trembling hands and a pale face, was running back and forth, her choked voice echoing down the hallways. "Emily. Has anyone seen Emily?" she cried, the desperation in her voice growing with each negative response. The principal, Mrs. Marquez, emerged from her office, her eyes wide at the commotion. "Clara, what's going on?" "It's Emily, she's missing," Claire sobbed, the tears finally breaking through her professional composure. "I've counted and recounted. She's nowhere to be found." Mrs. Marquez grabbed the phone, her fingers frantically dialing the police. "We have a missing student in Butterfly Forest," she informed, her voice trembling slightly. "Please come quickly. Every minute counts." In a matter of moments, what was supposed to be a peaceful school outing turned into a large-scale search operation. Sirens pierced the air, their wails echoing through the forest like a dark omen. At the edge of the woods, a car screeched to a halt, and out jumped Sophie and Tom, Emily's parents. Their faces were streaked with tears, their eyes swollen and red from hours of crying in pure terror. "Where's my daughter?" Sophie screamed, running toward Ms. Clara. "How could you lose her?" Tom, trying to keep his composure, held tightly onto Black's leash, the family's Labrador, who was pulling anxiously as if he understood the gravity of the situation. Clara, devastated by guilt, could barely face the parents. I'm so sorry," she murmured, her voice almost inaudible. "We did everything right, I swear. She just disappeared." "Disappeared?" Tom growled, his voice a mixture of anger and fear. "Children don't just disappear, Clara. She was under your care." A police officer approached the group, his expression grave. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson? I'm Sergeant Mendez. We're mobilizing all our teams. Helicopters are on their way, and we have search dogs ready to enter the forest." Sophie grabbed the officer's arm, her eyes pleading. "Please find my girl. She's only 10. She must be so scared. The hours dragged on mercilessly. The sun, once bright and cheerful, now seemed to mock the search efforts, casting longer and longer shadows over the forest. Rescue teams plunged into the dense woods, their voices echoing among the trees.
Emily.
Emily, can you hear us? Every unanswered call felt like a knife to the parents' hearts. Sophie, exhausted, collapsed to the ground, sobbing uncontrollably. My baby, my little Emily. Tom, trying to stay strong for his wife, couldn't hold back his own tears. We'll find her, Sophie. We have to believe that. Black, the loyal Labrador, whimpered softly, tugging persistently on the leash toward the forest. His brown eyes seemed to hold a wisdom beyond human understanding, as if he knew something everyone else didn't. As night fell, flashlights pierced the darkness of the forest, their beams dancing between the trees like giant fireflies. The search continued relentlessly, but fear grew with every minute that passed without news. At the makeshift operations base, Sergeant Mendez was studying maps, his face marked with worry. Expand the search perimeter, he ordered his team. We can't leave a single square meter unchecked. Meanwhile, at the edge of the forest, Sophie and Tom clung to each other, their bodies trembling not just from the night's cold but from the terror of the unknown. The distant bark of a search dog echoed in the darkness, bringing a bittersweet mix of hope and despair. The night pressed on, unyielding, as the entire community came together in silent vigil, praying for the safe return of a little girl lost in the vast green expanse of Butterfly Forest. Dawn brought little comfort to Emily. Her eyes, swollen from crying, burned with the sunlight filtering through the leaves. Her stomach growled, cruelly reminding her that she hadn't eaten in nearly a full day. Her throat, dry and scratchy, begged for water. Water, she murmured to herself, her voice hoarse. Dad always said, water is life. With shaky legs, Emily stood up, forcing herself to remember the survival lessons her father used to share during their backyard camping trips. Listen to the forest, princess. Tom's voice echoed in her memory. Water always speaks to those who know how to listen. Closing her eyes, Emily tried to silence the fear screaming in her mind. Slowly, the sounds of the forest began to stand out, the rustling of leaves, the distant chirping of birds, and a soft, steady murmur. Water, she exclaimed, a flicker of hope igniting in her chest. Guided by the sound, Emily stumbled through the dense underbrush. Branches scratched her arms and legs, but she barely noticed, focused solely on the promising sound growing louder. Finally, she emerged into a small clearing. A crystal-clear stream wound between the rocks, its water sparkling like diamonds under the morning sun. Emily dropped to her knees at the edge of the stream, drinking greedily. The cool water soothed her parched throat, bringing tears of relief to her eyes. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered, feeling a pang of longing so strong it almost made her collapse again. With her thirst quenched, Emily's stomach growled even louder. Looking around, she tried to recall Ms. Clara's science lessons. "Fruits, which ones are safe?" she murmured, scanning the trees around her. Her eyes landed on a bush full of small blueberries. Emily's heart leaped as she recognized them. "Wild blueberries," she exclaimed, vividly remembering the lesson on edible plants. With trembling hands, she picked a handful and brought them to her mouth, a mixture of desperation and gratitude washing over her. The sweet, slightly tart flavor burst on her tongue, bringing a momentary wave of comfort. Emily ate until she felt full, tucking some berries into her pockets for later. As the day wore on, Emily wandered through the forest, always keeping the stream nearby. Every sound made her jump, imagining rescuers or predators. When the sun began to set, fear returned with full force. The darkness of the previous night was still vivid in her memory. "I need shelter," she told herself, her voice trembling. Her eyes scanned the area until they landed on a massive tree, its roots forming a sort of natural cave. Curling up between the roots, Emily pulled her knees to her chest, trying to shield herself from the cold that was beginning to settle in. The nighttime sounds of the forest grew around her. The the hooting of owls, the rustling of small animals in the brush, and occasionally, distant howls that made her blood run cold. To stave off the paralyzing fear, Emily began to hum softly, a lullaby her mother used to sing. "Sleep, my angel. Don't be afraid. Mommy is here, always by your side. Close your little eyes, dream of love, for tomorrow will be a better day." Her voice, though shaky and broken by occasional sobs, seemed to create a bubble of comfort around her. Tears ran silently down her cheeks as she repeated the song, imagining her mother's warm, safe arms around her. "Mommy, Daddy," she whispered into the darkness. "Please find me soon. I promise I'll never disobey again. I just want to go home." The night dragged on, relentless. Emily fought against sleep, afraid of what might happen if she let her guard down. But eventually, physically and emotionally exhausted, she succumbed to a restless sleep, filled with nightmares of threatening shadows and distant screams. The full moon shone in the sky, casting a silver light over the lonely girl, curled up between the roots of an ancient tree, lost in the vastness of Butterfly Forest. In the Thompson household, the silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional sound of Black's nails scratching at Emily's bedroom door. The white Labrador, usually cheerful and playful, was now in a constant state of agitation, his brown eyes fixed on the door as if expecting his young owner to appear at any moment. Sophie, with dark circles under her eyes and a face marked by sleepless nights, watched the dog's behavior with a mix of pain and fascination. "Richard," she called to her husband, her voice hoarse from crying, "are you seeing this?" Richard emerged from the kitchen, an untouched cup of coffee in his trembling hands. "What?" he asked, his tone exhausted and distant. "Black," Sophie pointed to the dog. "He hasn't stopped sniffing Emily's things since." She couldn't finish the sentence, a sob catching in her throat. Hearing Emily's name, the lab let out a sharp whine and began scratching the door with more intensity. "He misses her," Richard murmured, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Just like we do." Sophie suddenly stood up, a sudden idea lighting up her tired eyes. "Her clothes, Richard. The smell." "What do you mean?" Richard asked, confused. "The search dogs," Sophie explained, her voice gaining urgency. "They use scent to track, right? What if we take one of Emily's shirts to them?" A glimmer of hope crossed Richard's worn face. Without hesitation, the couple rushed to their daughter's room, rummaging through drawers until they found a recently worn shirt of Emily's. Minutes later, they were back at the edge of the Butterfly Forest, Emily's shirt clutched tightly in Sophie's hands. Sergeant Mendez met them, his face showing the exhaustion of days of fruitless searching. "Sergeant," Sophie panted, holding out the shirt, "please use this. It's Emily's scent. Maybe it will help the dogs find her." The officer nodded, taking the piece of clothing. "Great idea, Mrs. Thompson. I'll pass this to our K-9 team immediately." As the sergeant walked away to instruct the search team, Sophie and Richard stood by the car, with Black restlessly beside them. The lab pulled at his leash, his eyes fixed on the forest, as if he could see something the humans couldn't. Suddenly, with a movement too quick to stop, Black broke free from the leash and darted into the woods, disappearing among the trees in seconds. "Black." "No!" Sophie shouted, the panic in her voice drawing the attention of everyone around. Richard was already running towards the forest, shouting over his shoulder. "He must have picked up her scent. We have to follow him." Sergeant Mendez and his team rushed to intercept them. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, please. It's too dangerous to enter the forest without proper gear." Sophie grabbed the officer's arm, her eyes pleading. "You don't understand. Black knows Emily's scent better than any other dog. He can find her. Please," Richard begged, his voice thick with emotion. "Let us go with the search team. We can't just stand here while our daughter is out there, alone and scared." The sergeant hesitated, the conflict evident on his face. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he reluctantly nodded. "All right, but you stay with our team the whole time. No wandering off, understood?" Sophie and Richard nodded fervently, adrenaline and renewed hope surging through them. As they prepared to enter the forest, following Black's trail, the couple exchanged a look filled with emotion. "We'll find her, Sophie," Richard whispered, squeezing his wife's hand. "We have to find her." Sophie nodded, silent tears streaming down her face. "Emily's sweetheart," she murmured into the forest ahead of her. "Mommy and Daddy are coming. Hold on, my love." And so, guided by the unwavering determination of a dog and the desperate love of parents, the group plunged into the depths of the butterfly forest, each step taking them deeper into the darkness and, perhaps, closer to Emily. Black's paws barely touched the ground as he ran, his black body a blurred shadow against the green of the forest. His eyes, fixed on an invisible point ahead, shone with an almost human-like determination. The Labrador's nose worked frantically, filtering through the cacophony of forest scents, the damp earth, wildflowers, the small animals fleeing his path. But Black was focused on a single scent, faint and precious, that pulled him like an invisible thread through the maze of trees. Emily's scent. Behind him, panting and stumbling over roots and stones, came the search team. Sophie and Richard, driven by desperation and hope, led the group, their eyes never leaving Black's swift form. He's going too fast," Sophie gasped, her face flushed from the effort. "We're going to lose sight of him." Richard, ignoring the burning in his lungs, grabbed his wife's hand. "We can't stop now, Sophie. Black is our only hope." Sergeant Mendez, a few steps behind, shouted to the couple, "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, you need to slow down. It's too dangerous to run like this in the forest." But his words fell on deaf ears. Sophie and Richard were beyond caution, driven by a love and fear that outweighed any concern for their own safety. The forest around them grew denser, the trees taller and older. The daylight barely penetrated the thick canopy, casting the group in a greenish, shadowy twilight. We're moving too far away from the search area," one of the firefighters panted, his voice laced with concern. Sergeant Mendez nodded grimly. "We've never explored this deep. It's uncharted territory." Black, oblivious to human worries, continued his relentless run. His muscles burned, his paws ached, but he refused to slow down. In his canine mind, one image drove him forward. Emily's smiling face, her gentle hand stroking his fur. Suddenly, the Labrador stopped abruptly, nearly causing Sophie and Richard to collide with him. His entire body went tense, ears perked, nose pointing in a specific direction. "What is it?" Richard asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Did he find something?" Sophie knelt beside Black, her eyes desperately scanning the dense foliage for any sign of her daughter. "Black, sweetheart, what do you smell?" The dog let out a low whine, looking at Sophie with eyes that seemed to plead for her to understand. Then, without warning, he bolted again, this time in a slightly different direction. "Let's go," Richard shouted, pulling Sophie along with him. He must have picked up something. Sergeant Mendez, seeing the parents' unwavering determination, simply signaled for his team to follow. "Keep visual contact with each other," he ordered. "This part of the forest is treacherous." As they ran, the forest seemed to close in around them. Branches scratched their faces and arms. Treacherous roots threatened to trip them with every step. But none of that mattered. The world had narrowed down to a single mission: follow Black, find Emily. Sophie, her heart pounding in her chest, whispered a continuous prayer. "Please, God, please. Let her be okay. Let us find her." Richard, beside her, kept his eyes fixed on Black, as if the dog were a beacon in the growing darkness of the forest. His mind replayed every moment with Emily, every laugh, every hug, fueling the flame of hope that refused to go out. The search team followed in silence, both impressed and a little frightened by the intensity of the scene unfolding before them. Black's devotion, the palpable desperation of the parents, the almost mystical atmosphere of the ancient forest, it all combined to create an almost unbearable tension. And so, guided by the unerring instinct of a loyal dog, The group ventured deeper into the heart of the butterfly forest, where ancient secrets slept and where, perhaps, a lost girl waited to be found. The morning of the fourth day dawned cold and damp in the butterfly forest. Emily, curled up between the gnarled roots of an ancient tree, was shivering uncontrollably. Her lips, cracked from dehydration, let out small whimpers of pain and exhaustion. Her eyes, once bright with curiosity, were now dull and sunken, surrounded by dark circles that contrasted with the sickly pallor of her skin. Suddenly, a distant sound broke the silence of the forest. Emily blinked slowly, her exhausted mind struggling to process what she was hearing. Was that a bark? No, it couldn't be. It must be another hallucination brought on by hunger and fear. But the sound came again, louder this time. A familiar bark that made her heart race. "Be black," Emily whispered, her voice no more than a hoarse breath. "Is that you, boy?" Summoning the last of her strength, Emily crawled out of her makeshift shelter. Her legs, weak and trembling, barely managed to support her. "Black," she screamed, her voice cracking with the effort. "Black, I'm here." The bark came again, closer now, urgent and full of emotion. Emily staggered toward the sound, stumbling over roots and stones, ignoring the scratches from low branches that whipped at her face and arms. "Please," she begged between sobs. "Please find me." Suddenly, a black blur burst through the vegetation. Black, his fur tangled with branches and leaves, his eyes shining with joy and relief, leapt onto Emily, knocking her to the soft forest floor. "Black," Emily cried, wrapping her frail arms around the dog's neck. "Oh, Black, you found me. You really found me." The Labrador licked Emily's face frantically, whining and barking as if he wanted to tell her all about his journey. Emily buried her face in Black's soft fur, her tears of joy and relief mixing with the dirt and sweat of days filled with fear and loneliness. "I knew you'd come," she sobbed, clinging to the dog as if her life depended on it. "I knew they wouldn't leave me." As Emily and Black reunited, distant voices began to echo through the forest.
"Emily."
Sophie's voice, filled with hope and fear, rang out across the clearing. "Emily, sweetheart, are you there?" "Emma?" Emily shouted back, her voice breaking with emotion. "Dad? I'm here." Rushed footsteps approached, snapping branches and pushing aside bushes. Suddenly, Sophie and Richard burst into the clearing, their faces a mix of exhaustion, fear, and pure joy at the sight of their daughter. "My baby," Sophie cried, dropping to her knees beside Emily, wrapping her in a desperate embrace. "Oh my God, you're alive. You're here." Richard joined the embrace, wrapping his protective arms around his wife and daughter, silent sobs shaking his body. "Emily, my little warrior," he murmured through tears. "You were so brave." Surrounded by the warmth and love of her parents, Emily finally allowed herself to break down completely. I thought I'd never see you again," she wept, her voice muffled against her mother's chest. "I was so scared." "Sure, it's all right now," Sophie whispered, stroking Emily's tangled hair. "We're here. You're safe." Black, sensing the intensity of the moment, gently pressed against the reunited family, as if he wanted to protect them from any remaining dangers the forest might offer. Around them, the rescue team arrived, their voices mixing relief and excitement at witnessing the reunion. Sergeant Mendez, with tears in his eyes, spoke quickly into his radio, requesting immediate medical assistance. But for Emily, in that moment, the world had shrunk to that one embrace. The warmth of her parents, the familiar smell of home they carried, and Black's loyal presence, all of it combined to create a bubble of safety and love that began to heal the invisible wounds left by days of solitude and fear. "Let's go home," Richard said softly, kissing his daughter's forehead. "We're taking you home." And so, in the arms of her parents and with Black faithfully by her side, Emily finally left the nightmare of the butterfly forest behind, ready to face the long road of recovery ahead, but secure in the knowledge that she would never truly be alone again. Emily's return to the city was met with an explosion of emotion. Ambulance and police sirens announced her arrival, while a crowd gathered in the streets, holding welcome signs and colorful balloons. At the hospital, while Emily received the necessary care, the waiting room overflowed with reporters and citizens eager for news. Sophie and Richard, exhausted but relieved, faced the cameras with tearful eyes. "How do you feel now that Emily is safe?" a reporter asked, microphone in hand. Sophie, her voice choked with emotion, replied, "Grateful, eternally grateful, and forever indebted to our four-legged hero, Black." The mention of Black's name triggered a wave of emotional murmurs among those present. The Labrador, still dirty from the forest adventure, sat quietly beside Richard, seemingly unaware of his newfound fame. Days later, the town hall was decorated with banners and flowers. A crowd gathered in the central square for a special ceremony honoring Black. The mayor, a burly man with a wide smile, stepped up to the podium. "Citizens," he began, his voice echoing through the speakers, "today we celebrate not only the safe return of one of our children, but also the extraordinary courage of an animal who reminds us of the true meaning of loyalty and love." Emily, still pale but with a renewed sparkle in her eyes, stepped onto the stage with Black by her side. The mayor knelt, holding a golden medal. "Black," he said solemnly, as if the dog could understand every word, "for your bravery and devotion, I award you the city's Medal of Honor." As the mayor placed the medal around Black's neck, the crowd erupted in applause and cheers. Emily knelt, hugging her faithful companion, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. At school, Emily was welcomed as a hero. Her classmates surrounded her, eager to hear her story. During a special assembly, the principal asked Emily to share her experience. With a trembling voice, Emily began, I thought I was going to die out there. But then I remembered the survival lessons my dad taught me. And I thought about Black, how he would never give up searching for me." A reverent silence fell over the auditorium. A classmate timidly raised her hand. "Were you scared?" Emily nodded, her eyes distant. "Very. But fear, it can teach you things. It taught me to be strong, to not give up." That night, at home, Emily sat on the floor of her room, Black resting his head in her lap. She absent-mindedly stroked his ears, lost in thought. Sophie quietly entered, watching the scene with a tight heart. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" Emily looked at her mother, her eyes filled with wisdom beyond her years. "Mom, do you think Black really understands how special he is?" Sophie sat beside her daughter, wrapping her in a gentle hug. "I think he understands what truly matters, that he loves you, and that you love him back." Emily nodded, burying her face in Black's fur. "In the forest," she whispered, "I talked to him, even though I knew he wasn't there. And somehow, I felt like he could hear me." Sophie fought back tears. "Love, Emily, sometimes makes things happen that we can't explain." That night, while the city slept, a girl and her dog stayed awake, bound by a connection forged in the depths of a dark forest, a silent testament to the unbreakable power of love and loyalty.